This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The weight of the crown of Elandor was never measured in gold, but in the suffocating silence echoing through the marble halls. Emperor Lucian Theros sat upon his throne, a man carved from obsidian, his heart a locked fortress since the day his empress was laid in the cold earth. For a decade, he had ruled alone, but now the council demanded an heir to secure the bloodline. Lucian saw only greed in the noble daughters of the land. He didn't want a queen to share his life. He wanted a shadow, a woman so utterly insignificant that her presence would be nothing more than a flicker in the vast dark expanse of his lonely, eternal reign. Far from the capital, Elara Venn moved like a shadow among shadows in a forgotten rural convent, her existence a quiet hum in a world that never learned her name. She was the orphan no one would mourn, possessing only the resilience born from a lifetime of being overlooked. When the Imperial Guard arrived at the rusted gates, they didn't seek a beauty, but the one soul whose disappearance would cause no ripple in society. Elara felt the weight of destiny as they draped her in silks that felt like heavy chains. She was being sold to a man who needed her body for his empire, but had no intention of acknowledging the heart trapped within. Standing before him in the great hall, she looked like a fragile bird caught in a storm of gold. Lucian did not rise, his gaze sweeping over her with a clinical indifference that should have broken her. Yet Elara did not look away in terror. She saw a man drowning in his own power, a recognition that made the Emperor's hand tremble for the first time in years. He touched her throat, his voice a low growl. "You are here to give this empire a future, and then you will be forgotten." Elara didn't flinch, but as a single tear fell onto his glove, Lucian realized he hadn't chosen a disposable shadow, but the woman who would shatter his world. Before we delve deeper into this story of power and forgotten souls, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our narratives. Your comments and thoughts help these stories breathe and grow, and we would love to hear how Elara's journey touches your heart. Let us return to the shadows of the palace, where a silent contract is about to change the fate of an entire empire. The morning light in Elandor always felt clinical, reflecting off the polished stones of a palace that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Emperor Lucian Theros stood by the window, his broad shoulders carrying the invisible burden of 1,000,000 lives. Yet his own life felt hollow. The council had spent the previous hour barking about lineage and the necessity of a biological successor, their voices grating against his nerves like rusted iron. They didn't see a man who had mourned in silence for 10 years. They saw a dying flame that needed to be fanned back to life for the sake of political stability. Lucian's decision to choose someone like Elara wasn't born from cruelty, but from a desperate need for peace within his own walls. He wanted a woman who required nothing from him, no affection, no conversation, and certainly no shared memories of a past he wished to bury. If he chose a duchess or a princess, the palace would be filled with the noise of ambition and the scent of expensive perfumes that only reminded him of what he had lost. He needed a ghost, someone whose name would never be etched into the annals of history alongside his own. A vessel for the future who would remain silent. In the quiet corners of the St. Jude convent, Elara had perfected the art of being invisible long before the Emperor's men arrived to claim her. She spent her days scrubbing floors and tending to the herb gardens, her hands calloused and her heart tucked away behind a veil of quiet resignation. Being forgotten was her only constant companion, a familiar ache that she had learned to treat with the same indifference the world showed her. When the Mother Superior told her she had been chosen by the crown, Elara didn't feel a sense of triumph or joy. she felt a profound, chilling sense of inevitability. The journey to the capital was a blur of shifting landscapes and cold, metallic armor, as the guards treated her more like a fragile artifact than a living being. Elara watched the world through the narrow slit of the carriage window, seeing the vastness of the empire she was meant to serve, yet feeling smaller than ever before. The palace of Elandor rose before her like a golden beast, its spires piercing the clouds with a ferocity that made her breath catch in her throat. She stepped onto the marble floors in her simple wool dress, a stark contrast to the opulence that threatened to swallow her whole. When she finally stood in the presence of the Emperor, the air in the room seemed to freeze, held captive by the sheer weight of his silent judgment. Lucian didn't look at her eyes. He looked through her, as if she were a pane of glass that happened to be standing in his way. He spoke only to his advisors, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Elara's chest, dismissing her presence before she had even been given the chance to speak. She was moved to a wing of the palace that smelled of old parchment and neglected dust, a gilded cage where her loneliness would finally meet his. Lucian walked through the corridors of the West Wing, a place he had avoided for exactly 10 long years. The air there was stagnant, heavy with the scent of dried lilies and the lingering shadow of a woman who was no longer there. Every step felt like a betrayal to the silence he had cultivated, a silence that protected him from the sharp edges of his own memory. He thought of the girl from the convent, wondering if her presence would stir the dust of his mourning or simply settle beneath it. He had built a life on the premise that feeling nothing was the only way to survive. In her new quarters, Elara sat on the edge of a bed so large it felt like an island in a sea of gold leaves. The silk of her nightgown was so smooth it felt abrasive against her skin, a constant reminder that she did not belong in this temple of excess. She missed the scratchy wool of her habit and the predictable chime of the convent bells that told her when to pray and when to sleep. Here, time was measured in the hushed whispers of servants who looked at her with pity, and the terrifying realization that she was now property of the state. On the other side of the palace, Lucian tried to lose himself in the maps of Elandor's borders, tracing the lines of his kingdom with a finger that felt cold to the bone. His advisors spoke of trade routes and taxes, but their voices were merely background noise to the internal roar of his own isolation. He was a king who ruled by fear because he had forgotten how to rule by anything else. He knew the court called him the Iron Emperor, a title he wore like armor to prevent the world from seeing the hollow space where his heart used to beat with life. Elara refused to call the maids when she spilled a drop of ink on the mahogany table, kneeling to scrub the floor with a piece of her own hem. It was a reflexive action, the habit of a girl who had spent her life cleaning the dirt of others without ever being thanked. She did not know how to exist in a space where her only job was to be present and prepared. Each time a servant bowed, she felt a wave of panic, wanting to tell them she was no one special, that a mistake had been made. She was a placeholder in someone else's story. Late that night, while the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the courtyard, Lucian found himself standing outside the heavy oak doors of Elara's suite. He did not knock, but stayed there for a long time, listening to the absolute silence coming from within. He expected to hear sobs or the frantic pacing of a frightened girl, but there was only a stillness that matched his own. It was a silence that felt heavy with unanswered questions, a silence that suggested she was not just a shadow, but a witness. He walked away, his boots echoing, trying to escape that quiet presence. The first formal morning arrived with a suffocating sense of duty that Lucian wore like a second skin. He sat at the head of a table long enough to host a dozen lords, yet only 2 places were set, separated by a vast expanse of white linen and silver. He didn't look up as Elara entered, her footsteps so light they barely registered against the heavy stone floor. To him, she was a necessary transaction, a ghost he had invited into his home to satisfy the hungry demands of his ministers. He cut his meat with precise clinical movements, his eyes fixed on the reports of a distant war. Elara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like two small pale birds. She had spent years mastering the art of being still, of blending into the background until she was part of the architecture itself. The grandeur of the breakfast hall was meant to intimidate, but she only saw the loneliness in the way the sunlight hit the dust motes dancing in the air. She realized that while she had been a prisoner of poverty, the emperor was a prisoner of his own grandeur. She didn't touch the feast before her, her stomach tightening with the knowledge that her purpose was purely biological. Lucian finally lowered his fork, the sound of silver hitting porcelain echoing through the room like a gunshot. He didn't offer a greeting or a kind word, but instead, his voice cut through the air, cold and devoid of any warmth or human connection. He told her plainly that her life here would be one of comfort, but total emotional isolation, a contract written in stone. He made it clear that he had no room for another soul in his life, and that once she provided the heir Elandor required, she would be retired to a quiet estate, never to be seen. Elara didn't flinch at his words, for she had been told she was a burden since the day she was left at the convent steps. Rejection was the only language she had ever spoken fluently, and she found a strange comfort in his honesty compared to the false smiles of the palace staff. She watched the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of the future, sensing a phantom presence sitting in the empty chair beside him. She knew then that she wasn't competing with the living, but with a memory so powerful it had turned a man into a monument of grief. As he rose to leave without waiting for her response, the heavy doors groaned under the weight of his departure, leaving her once again in the hollow silence. She looked at the abandoned feast and felt a surge of pity for the man who possessed everything but lacked the warmth of a single true companion. He believed he was protecting himself by keeping her at a distance, but Elara understood that walls worked both ways. As the shadows of the afternoon began to stretch across the room, she realized that their shared journey into the dark was only just beginning to take form. The council's eyes were everywhere, 100 invisible observers judging the validity of a union that was nothing more than a political necessity. Lucian found himself forced to endure Elara's presence during the long evening hours, when he usually retreated into the fortress of his paperwork. He commanded her to sit in the far corner of his private study, a room where no soul had entered for years, hoping she would remain as still as the marble busts lining the walls. He focused on his ledgers, the scratch of his quill the only sound in the suffocating room, yet he could feel her heartbeat in the air. Elara sat exactly where she was told, her hands folded over a small book she had brought from the convent, but her eyes were not on the pages. She watched the way the emperor's brow furrowed in the dim candlelight, the deep lines of exhaustion that carved canyons into his handsome, frozen face. He moved with a precision that seemed to demand perfection from the very shadows, yet he looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe without effort. She noticed the fire in the hearth was dying, the embers gasping for air, mirroring the coldness that seemed to radiate from his soul. Without a word, she rose from her chair, her movement so fluid and silent that Lucian didn't even look up from his maps. She knelt before the hearth, her small hands picking up the iron poker to stir the sleeping flames back to life with a practiced, gentle touch. A soft glow began to bathe the room, chasing away the biting chill that had settled in the corners of the stone walls. Lucian's quill paused for a fraction of a second, the ink blooming into a dark stain on the parchment as he watched her out of the corner of his eye, surprised by her quiet initiative. He wanted to demand why she moved without his permission, why she dared to disturb the static coldness of his sanctuary. But the words died in his throat. There was no defiance in her posture, only a quiet, unassuming care that felt more intrusive than a shout would have been. He looked at her pale profile, realizing that she wasn't trying to please him or win his favor like the noblewomen who had haunted his court for years. She was simply existing in the space he provided, occupying the silence with a grace that made his own rigid presence feel suddenly clumsy and unnecessarily loud. As she returned to her corner, her gaze accidentally brushed against a small, silver-framed portrait hidden beneath a stack of old letters on his desk. Lucian's hand shot out, covering the image with a speed that was almost violent, his eyes flashing with a sudden searing pain that he quickly tried to mask with anger. He expected her to recoil or apologize with a stuttering voice, but she only looked at him with a profound, terrifying empathy that saw right through his armor. In that moment, the Emperor realized that the woman no one would miss was the only one truly seeing him. Lucian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, a sensation he hadn't felt since the funeral pyre had turned his world to ash. He wanted to scream at Elara, to banish her to the furthest tower for daring to look at the face of his ghost, yet the words felt like dry sand in his mouth. He looked at her small, still form and felt a surge of resentment because she hadn't flinched from his anger. Her calm was an insult to his turmoil, a mirror reflecting the jagged edges of a soul he had tried so hard to smooth into stone for his people. Elara kept her eyes lowered, not out of fear, but out of a deep, instinctive respect for a wound that was still bleeding after all these years. She had seen that look before in the eyes of the dying at the convent, the desperate, clawing need to hold on to a memory before it faded into the gray mist of time. She didn't need his permission to understand his agony, for her own life was a collection of things lost and people who never came back. She realized that his power was merely a magnificent tomb, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something far more dangerous than pity. The following days were marked by a heavy atmospheric pressure that seemed to precede a storm that never arrived. Lucian commanded her to accompany him to the imperial gardens, a place of sculpted hedges and silent fountains, where the air was thick with the scent of jasmine. He walked 3 paces ahead, his cloak billowing like a dark cloud, while she followed with the practiced patience of a shadow. They didn't speak, but the space between them hummed with the electricity of things left unsaid. He found himself slowing his stride, an unconscious concession to the fact that she was there, walking through his world. As the evening breeze turned sharp, Lucian noticed Elara's shoulders tremble beneath the thin fabric of her dress. He stopped abruptly, his mind battling the urge to ignore her discomfort, as he had ignored the needs of so many others before. But the memory of her kneeling at his hearth, tending to his fire, flickered in his mind like a stubborn flame. Without turning to look at her, he unfastened the heavy fur-lined mantle from his shoulders and held it out. It was a silent command, a gesture of protection that felt like a betrayal of his own vow to remain completely and utterly detached. Elara took the cloak, the weight of it surprising her, smelling of cedarwood and the cold, sharp scent of the winter mountains. It was still warm from his body, a phantom heat that seeped into her skin and made her heart skip a beat. As she draped it around her, she looked at the broad expanse of his back, seeing the tension in his neck and the way his hands were clenched into fists. He was a man who knew how to command armies but didn't know how to offer a simple kindness without feeling like he was losing a battle. The wall was still there, but it was cracking. The days following the garden incident were draped in an uneasy truce, as if the air itself had become thicker with the weight of unspoken realizations. Lucian retreated further into his duties, yet his thoughts drifted constantly to the way his heavy cloak had looked on Elara's small frame. He felt a strange, nagging irritation at the fact that she had accepted it so quietly, without the fawning gratitude he was used to receiving from those beneath him. Every time he saw her in the peripheral of his vision, he was reminded that his iron fortress was no longer as impenetrable as he had once believed it to be. The first formal court banquet since Elara's arrival was a gauntlet of whispered insults and predatory smiles, designed to shred the dignity of a commoner. Elara stood by Lucian's side, her presence a muted stain of simplicity against the blinding jewels and silk tapestries of the high-born ladies. She could feel their eyes like needles, stitching her into a narrative of shame and inadequacy, yet she kept her chin high and her gaze steady. Lucian watched the predatory way his ministers looked at her, seeing her not as a woman, but as a temporary tool, and a cold, sharp anger began to boil beneath his skin. During the feast, a duchess made a biting comment about the lack of lineage in the room, her laughter ringing out like a discordant bell in the crowded hall. Elara didn't respond with anger. Instead, she looked at the woman with a quiet, devastating clarity that seemed to strip away the duchess's expensive layers of pretense. It was a silent victory that few noticed, but Lucian saw it, and he found himself leaning closer to Elara than was strictly necessary. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to shield her from the venom of his court, not because she was fragile, but because she was the only real person in a room of ghosts. After the banquet, in the candlelit sanctuary of his private chambers, Lucian presented her with a necklace of raw emeralds, his voice gruff and demanding as he insisted she wear it. He told her it was a matter of imperial protocol, a way to signal her status to those who would dare to mock her. But Elara only looked at the jewels with a sense of profound sadness. She gently pushed the box back toward him, telling him that gold could not buy the respect of those who had already decided she was nothing. Her refusal was a quiet thunderclap that left Lucian speechless, his world of transactions failing against her simple truth. He stepped toward her, the space between them evaporating until he could smell the faint, clean scent of rainwater and old books that seemed to follow her everywhere. His hand reached out, almost of its own accord, his fingers brushing against the pulse point at her throat as if to prove she was actually there. He felt the rapid, rhythmic beat of her heart against his skin, a vibration of life that terrified him more than any battlefield ever could. He pulled away as if burned, the silence in the room suddenly too heavy to bear, wondering if he was the one who was truly being chosen by the woman he had intended to discard. The rejection of the emeralds left a bitter taste in Lucian's mouth, a mixture of frustration and a strange burgeoning respect that he refused to name. He spent the remainder of the night in his war room, staring at maps that seemed suddenly meaningless compared to the quiet strength of the woman in the guest wing. He tried to convince himself that her defiance was merely a different form of manipulation, yet his heart knew the difference between a trap and a truth. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt that frantic, rhythmic pulse beneath his fingertips, a reminder that Elara was not a ghost, but a living, breathing storm. The following afternoon, a heavy rain descended upon the capital, turning the marble courtyards into shimmering mirrors of slate and gray. Lucian found himself in the great library, a cavernous space filled with the scent of ancient leather and the weight of 1,000 years of forgotten kings. He was surprised to find Elara there, tucked into a window seat with a book of common folk songs that seemed entirely out of place in such a grand setting. He stood in the shadows of the tall shelves, watching the way the soft light caught the stray strands of her hair, feeling a sudden, sharp ache for a life that was simple and filled with light. He stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the stone floor, and noticed that her hands were chapped and red from the cold air of the poorly heated room. Instead of reprimanding her for her presence, he walked to a hidden cabinet and pulled out a tin of rare, scented salve that had belonged to the royal family for generations. He didn't offer it with a smile, but placed it on the table beside her with a stern command that she must use it to maintain the dignity of her position. It was a lie, a thin veil for a concern he was not yet ready to admit even to himself. Yet she saw through it. Elara looked at the tin and then up at the man who stood over her like a brooding mountain, his eyes flickering with a vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She didn't thank him with words, but the way her gaze softened made Lucian feel as though he were the one who had been exposed. She realized that his cruelty was a shield, a jagged barrier he had built to keep the world from seeing the man who still carried the weight of a lost love in his every breath. In the silence of the library, the Emperor's armor seemed to thin, revealing a soul that was as starved for connection as she had ever been. As the thunder rumbled in the distance, Lucian did not leave her side, but instead sat in the chair opposite her, picking up a scroll he had no intention of reading. They sat together for hours, the only sound being the rain against the glass and the occasional crackle of the fireplace, a forced coexistence that was beginning to feel like a shared sanctuary. He watched her fingers trace the lines of her book, realizing that for the first time in a decade, the silence of the palace didn't feel like a death sentence. It was a quiet, trembling peace that threatened to shatter the very foundations of the empire he had sworn to protect. The corridors of the palace were no longer just empty spaces of stone. They had become breeding grounds for a poisonous kind of gossip. The sight of the emperor sitting in the library with a common orphan had sent a shockwave through the high-born families who had spent years trying to secure his favor. They saw Elara not as a person, but as a dangerous glitch in the machine of power they had meticulously built. Whispers of witchcraft and manipulation began to drift through the drawing rooms, fueled by a collective fear that the Iron Emperor was finally beginning to rust under the influence of a woman who had no right to his time. Lord Valerius, the head of the Imperial Council, chose a moment of strategic vulnerability to confront Lucian in the throne room. He spoke of the stability of the crown and the growing unrest among the noble houses, his voice a smooth blade of concern that cut through Lucian's defenses. Valerius reminded him that Elandor did not need a man with a heart, but a ruler with a vision, suggesting that Elara's presence was a stain on the imperial legacy. The pressure of centuries of tradition bore down on Lucian's shoulders, making him feel the weight of every ancestor who had chosen duty over the weakness of human affection or personal peace. Alone in the cold moonlight, Lucian felt the familiar pull of his own darkness, a sanctuary he had inhabited for so long that the light of Elara's presence felt like a searing burn. He looked at his hands, remembering the warmth of her pulse, and felt a sudden, sharp surge of self-loathing for allowing a mere girl to disturb the equilibrium of his reign. He convinced himself that her kindness was a trap, a subtle form of subversion meant to weaken his resolve and make him pliable to the whims of the weak. He decided then that the walls must be rebuilt, higher and thicker than before, to ensure the empire survived his own terrifying feeling. He entered her chambers the following night with the grace of a predator, his eyes devoid of the flickering warmth that had briefly haunted the library. He did not look at her with recognition, but with the cold, clinical assessment of a man inspecting a piece of property he found suddenly distasteful. His voice was a whip of ice as he reminded her that she was there for a singular, biological purpose, and that her attempts to integrate herself into his personal life were both noted and unwelcome. He spoke words meant to wound, to drive a wedge between the human connection they had shared, re-establishing the brutal hierarchy that defined their world. Elara stood before him, the fur-lined cloak he had given her draped over a chair like a discarded memory, and she didn't say a single word in her own defense. She watched the way his eyes avoided hers, seeing the sheer effort it took for him to maintain such a mask of cruelty, and it broke her heart more than the insults ever could. She realized that he was more afraid of her than he was of the council or the brewing war at his borders, for she represented the one thing he couldn't control. As he turned his back on her, the silence between them was no longer a sanctuary, but a vast, frozen wasteland. The silence following Lucian's cruel decree was unlike the peaceful quiet they had shared in the library. It was a jagged, airless vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth from the stone walls. Elara retreated into the farthest corners of the palace, returning to the art of invisibility she had perfected since childhood. She no longer tended to the dying embers of his hearth, or looked up when his heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. She became the perfect shadow he had demanded, a compliant, silent ghost who existed only to serve the Empire's cold requirements. Yet, the victory Lucian sought felt like a heavy shroud over his weary shoulders. Lucian immersed himself in the machinery of the state, working until his eyes burned from the flicker of candlelight and the endless ink of tactical reports. He told himself that the distance was necessary for the survival of the crown, but the emptiness in his study felt more oppressive than any rebellion. He missed the quiet rustle of her pages and the scent of rain that seemed to follow her, a fragrance that reminded him he was still alive. Every time he looked at her empty chair, a sharp pang of regret pierced his armor, making him question the very foundation of his absolute power. Outside the palace gates, the noble houses were not satisfied with Lucian's return to coldness. They sensed a crack in the foundation and sought to widen it for their own gain. Lord Valerius began circulating whispers that Elara was a cursed omen, a girl from nowhere who had brought a weakening melancholy to the Iron Emperor. They suggested that her blood was too thin to carry the weight of the imperial lineage, and that a more suitable high-born match should be considered before winter. The court was a shark-infested sea, and Elara was the bait they intended to use to drown the king's newly found humanity. One evening, as a biting frost settled over the gardens, Lucian stood on his balcony and watched Elara walking alone by the frozen fountain. She was wrapped in a simple gray cloak, her head bowed as she traced the patterns of the ice with a delicate, trembling finger. She looked so small against the backdrop of his vast, monolithic empire, a fragile flame that he had personally tried to extinguish with his pride. He wanted to call out to her, to apologize for the words that had been meant to protect his own heart, but had only succeeded in wounding her quiet, resilient soul. The moment of silent observation was shattered when a messenger arrived with urgent news from the northern border, where a long-dormant threat was beginning to stir. Lucian's primary duty as a protector of Elandor suddenly clashed with the private storm raging in his chest, forcing him to realize that he could no longer keep his two worlds apart. If the Empire fell, Elara would be the first to suffer. Yet the very people he needed to lead were the ones plotting her quiet demise. He realized that the greatest threat to his reign wasn't an invading army, but the fear of losing the woman he had tried to hate. The rumors of war from the north arrived with the first biting winds of winter, chilling the hearts of the Elandor people. Lucian spent hours in the council chamber, surrounded by maps and grim-faced generals who demanded blood and iron. Yet, beneath the tactical discussions, Lord Valerius continued to weave a web of deceit, suggesting that the Emperor's distraction was the direct result of Elara's presence. They spoke of her as a parasite on his focus, a woman whose lowly birth had cursed the very ground she walked upon. Lucian's silence was interpreted as agreement, while his mind secretly searched for ways to keep her safe from their blades. In the quiet wing of the palace, Elara felt the temperature of the court drop long before the snow began to fall. The servants who once looked at her with pity now looked away with a mixture of fear and disdain, sensing the shift in the political winds. She understood that in the game of empires, she was a pawn meant to be sacrificed for the king's survival. She stayed in her rooms, watching the gray sky, wondering if the emperor truly believed the lies they told about her. The weight of being unloved was familiar, but being hated for nothing was a new, sharper kind of agony. The tension reached a breaking point during a cold afternoon when Elara ventured into the kitchens to fetch a cup of tea for herself. She was cornered by a group of noble ladies who had stayed late after a council session, their voices dripping with a refined, elegant cruelty. They mocked her convent-bred manners and whispered that the emperor would surely discard her the moment the war required a prestigious alliance. One woman deliberately stepped on the hem of Elara's dress, causing the fabric to tear with a sound that felt like a scream in the small space. Elara stood her ground, her face a mask of pale, unbreakable dignity. From the doorway, Lucian had seen the entire exchange, his hands clenched so tightly into fists that his knuckles turned as white as the falling snow. He wanted to storm into the room and banish every woman there, to proclaim Elara's worth to the world. But the ghost of his duty held him back. He was a man who lived in the service of an idea, and that idea demanded he prioritize the stability of the court over the feelings of a single girl. He realized with a sickening jolt that his attempt to distance himself from her had left her entirely vulnerable to the wolves. Later that night, as he paced the length of his dark study, the memory of her standing her ground against the duchesses burned in his mind. She didn't seek his help, and she didn't complain about the torn fabric or the whispered insults, which only made him feel more like a coward. He felt the walls of the empire closing in, realizing that the power he possessed was useless if it couldn't protect the one soul who wanted nothing from him. He knew a choice was coming, a moment where he would have to decide if he was the Emperor of Iron or merely a man who found home. Lucian sat in the war room, but the tactical maps of the northern borders were nothing but blurry lines of red and black ink. His mind was a battlefield of a different sort, haunted by the image of Elara's torn dress and her unwavering dignity in the face of such petty hatred. He realized that by trying to keep her at a distance to save his heart, he had painted a target on her back for every ambitious noble in Elandor. The fear of losing her was no longer a distant possibility. It was a cold, sharp blade pressing against his very throat. He had spent a decade fearing love, only to find that regret was a far more lethal enemy. In her cold chamber, Elara folded her few belongings into a wooden chest, her movements heavy with the weight of an ending. She knew the whispers were becoming shouts, and she didn't want the Emperor to choose between his empire and a girl who was never supposed to matter. She touched the tin of salve he had given her, a metal relic of a kindness he had tried to hide beneath his mask. She believed that leaving was her final act of service to the man who gave her a reason to exist. Her heart was breaking, but she was used to the cracks. They were the only things she owned. The door to her room creaked open, and Lucian stepped into the dim light, looking less like a sovereign and more like a man who had been wandering in the dark for far too long. He saw the open chest and the folded wool, and for a moment, the power he held over millions felt like a cruel joke. He walked toward her, his presence filling the room until the air felt tight with an unspoken need. He didn't order her to stay, nor did he apologize for his earlier cruelty. Instead, he took the chest from her hands, his touch a silent, trembling plea for her to remain in his lonely world. "They are coming for you, Elara," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged sound that broke the heavy silence. He explained that Valerius was no longer just whispering. He was actively plotting to have her removed under the guise of national security as the northern armies gathered. Lucian realized that as long as she was a nameless orphan, he could not protect her with the laws of the land, only with his sword. The realization that his counsel was his greatest enemy made him see the palace as a den of vipers, and Elara was the only innocent thing left within its suffocating, golden walls. Elara looked into his eyes and saw the Emperor fading, replaced by a man who was terrified of being alone again in the cold expanse of his own making. She reached out, her fingers grazing the fabric of his tunic, and told him that she wasn't afraid of the council, but only of seeing him lose his soul to the crown. The choice was no longer about a biological heir. It was about whether two broken people could find the courage to stand together against a world that demanded they remain apart. In that moment, the shadow and the king finally became one, bound by a shared, terrifying, and beautiful destiny. The dawn broke over Elandor with the color of bruised plums, a heavy, suffocating light that seemed to portend the end of an era. Inside the great council chamber, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the sharper metallic tang of fear. Lucian sat upon his throne, his jaw set in a line of frozen iron as he watched the ministers file in, their faces masks of feigned loyalty. He knew that this was the day the storm would break, the day the men who lived in his shadow would try to steal the only light he had found in years. Lord Valerius stepped forward, a scroll clutched in his withered hand like a weapon. He spoke of the sacred bloodline and the growing discontent among the northern lords who refused to fight for an emperor distracted by a peasant girl. With a voice dripping in false concern, he presented a petition signed by the highest houses, demanding Elara be banished to a distant monastery before the next moon rose. He claimed that her presence was a spiritual blight upon the throne, a distraction that would lead to the ruin of Elandor if the emperor did not act with the coldness expected of a Theros. Lucian felt the weight of 1,000 years of kings pressing down on his chest, their spectral voices whispering that a woman was nothing compared to the survival of the crown. He looked at the men who called themselves his allies, seeing only the greed that would swallow Elara whole the moment she left the palace gates. He realized that if he defied them now, he risked a civil war while the northern armies were already at the door. Every instinct told him to protect her, but the king in him knew that his protection might be the very thing that ensured her swift, quiet execution. Elara stood behind the heavy tapestry of the gallery, her heart shattering as she heard the venomous words of the council and the heavy, agonizing silence of the man she had learned to love. She realized that she had become the anchor dragging him into the depths of a political abyss, a burden that no amount of devotion could justify. The revelation was a cold, sharp pain. Her love for Lucian was no longer a secret sanctuary, but a weapon his enemies were using to destroy him. She stepped out from the shadows, her presence a sudden, startling bloom of white against the dark, heavy stone of the chamber. The room fell silent as she walked toward the throne, her gaze fixed only on Lucian's tortured eyes. In a voice that didn't tremble, she announced that she would leave Elandor of her own accord, sparing the Emperor the burden of a choice he was never meant to make. Lucian's heart stopped, his fear manifesting as a brutal, defensive anger as he realized she was sacrificing herself to save his throne. He rose, his voice a thunderous crack as he ordered her to leave the hall, his desperation making him sound like the tyrant he had promised her he would never truly be again. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of hushed murmurs, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a cold stone tomb. Lord Valerius's face held a look of predatory triumph, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a wolf that had successfully cornered its long-awaited prey. Lucian stood frozen on the dais, his hands gripping the arms of his throne so tightly that the ancient wood groaned under the immense pressure. He watched Elara turn away, her back straight despite the crushing weight of the room's collective hatred. In that moment, the crown felt like a circlet of white-hot iron, searing his brow with the unbearable price of his own authority. In the suffocating stillness of the hallway, Lucian caught her arm, his touch desperate and jarring against the heavy silence of the palace. He demanded to know why she would surrender, why she would let the Vipers win after everything they had shared in the quiet hours of the night. Elara looked at him with a gaze so clear it stripped away his imperial mask, revealing the frightened man beneath the heavy armor. She told him that she was born with nothing and was comfortable returning to nothing, but Elandor could not survive a leader who chose a shadow over a kingdom. Her words were a devastating act of love. The rain began to fall again, a cold and relentless drizzle that mirrored the gray despair settling over the palace grounds. Elara returned to her chambers, not to pack silks and jewels, but to don the simple wool habit she had arrived in weeks ago. The servants watched her with a mixture of awe and shame, realizing that the woman they had mocked was the only one with enough courage to save the Emperor from himself. Every step she took toward the outer gates felt like a hammer blow to Lucian's heart, a rhythmic reminder that the only soul who truly saw him was finally slipping through his fingers forever. Lucian retreated to his private study, the room where Elara had first tended to his fire and watched him with those hauntingly empathetic eyes. On his desk, placed precisely where he would find it, was a small scrap of cloth. It was the same fabric she had used to scrub the ink from his floors, now neatly washed and folded, accompanied by a single sprig of dried jasmine. It was a silent testament to her presence, a reminder that she had spent her time not seeking power, but quietly tending to the edges of his life. The sheer humility of the gesture shattered the last of his iron resolve. A terrifying realization swept over him, more potent than any tactical strategy or political maneuver he had ever conceived in his life. If he let her walk out of those gates, he would be the most powerful man in the world, yet he would be utterly and irrevocably dead inside. The Empire required a cold ruler, but he realized that a throne built on the sacrifice of the innocent was merely a pedestal for a monster. He didn't want the legacy of a man who ruled alone. He wanted the warmth of the woman who saw his scars. With a roar of defiance, he ran. Lucian's lungs burned, a sensation he hadn't felt since his youth, as he sprinted through the long, echoing hallways of the North Wing. His royal mantle, heavy with the weight of gold and tradition, felt like a strangling ghost behind him, snagging on the armor of passing guards who stood frozen in shock. He didn't care about the image of a sovereign running like a madman. He only cared about the closing distance between his heart and the woman who had carried the only warmth he had known in a decade. The marble floors under his boots seemed to scream with every step, mocking the man who had waited until the last second to admit he was hollow without his shadow. He reached the great gate, just as the iron portcullis began its slow, mechanical descent, a groaning sound that echoed the finality of a closing tomb. Elara was there, a small, solitary figure in gray wool, standing in the mud of the outer courtyard, while the rain soaked through her meager clothing. She didn't look back, her shoulders hunched against the cold as she prepared to walk into the vast, indifferent world that had always ignored her existence. Lucian felt a terrifying surge of panic, a primitive fear that if she took one more step, the connection that had painstakingly formed between them would snap like a brittle thread, leaving him in absolute darkness forever. "Stop!" his voice thundered, cracking with a raw, unrefined emotion that silenced the rain and the mechanical grind of the chains. The guards hesitated, caught between the Emperor's command and the protocols of the state, their spears trembling in their hands. Lord Valerius appeared on the high balcony, his face a mask of cold fury, shouting for the gates to be closed and for the law to be upheld for the sake of the Empire's future. Lucian ignored the ministers and the weight of the crown, his eyes fixed only on the back of the woman who had dared to love him without asking for a single thing in return for her devotion. Elara turned slowly, her face pale and wet with a mixture of rain and tears that she had tried so hard to hide from the world. Lucian stepped into the mud, his fine leather boots and silk robes ruined by the filth of the earth, as he closed the distance between them with a desperate, frantic energy. He took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were, and he realized he had been the one who had kept her in the winter of his own grief. He told her, in front of the soldiers and the spies, that a throne was just a cold chair if it wasn't shared by the only person who actually saw his soul. I have spent 10 years hiding from the ghost of a woman I couldn't save, only to become a man who was too afraid to live, he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers in a gesture of absolute, public vulnerability. The silence that followed was heavy with the judgment of 1,000 years of history, but Lucian didn't care about the ancestors or the angry lords watching from above. He looked at Elara and saw his destiny, not as a king who required an heir, but as a man who finally required a reason to breathe. He made his choice, knowing that by holding on to her, he was declaring war on the very empire he was born to rule. Lucian didn't just lead Elara back inside. He carried her over the threshold of a new Elandor. The mud on his robes was a badge of his humanity, a stain that the high-born lords watched with a mixture of horror and growing realization. He didn't look at the council members who stood like statues of judgment along the grand staircase. He only had eyes for the girl who had almost escaped his life. As they entered the great hall, the warmth of the hearth she once tended seemed to flare up in recognition, casting long, golden shadows that danced across the ancient stone. He was no longer a king protecting a border, but a man defending his home. Lord Valerius stepped into their path, his face a contorted mask of legalistic rage and desperate tradition. He began to speak of the laws of the Theros line, of the purity required for an imperial consort, and the danger of defying the noble houses during a time of imminent war. Lucian didn't let him finish, his voice a low, vibrating hum of power that felt more dangerous than any shout. He told the council that an empire built on the misery of its own people was an empire that deserved to burn. For the first time, he spoke not as a puppet of his lineage, but as the true architect of his own future. Elara felt the shift in the air, the way the palace seemed to breathe differently now that the emperor had shed his iron mask. She had lived her entire life believing she was a fragment of a person, a replaceable piece in a world that only valued blood and gold. But as Lucian held her hand in front of the most powerful men in the land, she realized that being seen was not a weakness, but a profound form of liberation. She looked at the council not with fear, but with the quiet strength of a woman who had survived the worst of the world and found her way back to the light. The news of the emperor's defiance spread through the capital like wildfire, turning the fear of the Northern War into a strange, hopeful curiosity. The servants who had once whispered insults now moved with a quiet, respectful efficiency, sensing that the lady of the palace was no longer a temporary guest. The atmospheric pressure of the court began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose that felt genuine rather than forced by the threat of the lash. Lucian spent the night not in his war room, but in the small parlor adjacent to Elara's chambers, ensuring that the shadows of the council could not reach her through the door of his protection. Later, in the absolute quiet of the midnight hour, they sat together by a fire that Lucian had built with his own hands. There was no talk of heirs or political alliances, only the slow, rhythmic sound of their breathing and the crackle of the dry logs. He looked at her and saw not a tool for his legacy, but the woman who had taught him that even a heart of stone could be softened by a simple cup of tea. He realized that his redemption didn't come from a victory on the battlefield, but from the simple, terrifying act of allowing himself to be loved by the woman no one would miss. The winter that threatened to consume Elandor eventually thawed, not under the heat of a burning war, but through the unexpected warmth radiating from a throne that had forgotten its humanity. Lucian led his armies to the northern border, but he did so with a clarity of purpose that no longer relied on fear. His soldiers saw a man who fought to protect a home he finally loved, rather than a cold monument to his own grief. The noble houses, once a nest of vipers, found themselves silenced by the sheer weight of his conviction. The empire didn't crumble under his choice. It began to breathe with a renewed vital strength. Inside the palace walls, the silence was no longer a suffocating shroud, but a comfortable sanctuary shared by two souls who had finally found their way home. Lucian no longer spent his nights buried in tactical maps and bitter memories. Instead, he found peace in the quiet presence of Elara, whose voice had become the only melody he cared to hear. They walked through the gardens as equals, their hands intertwined in a way that spoke of a bond forged in the fires of defiance. She was no longer the orphan from the convent, but the living heart of a kingdom that had once been built on the coldness of stone. It was a profound irony that the woman chosen because no one would miss her had become the only person in the world Lucian could not live without. He often watched her as she tended to the small things in the palace, the flowers, the servants, the dying fires, realizing that true power was not found in the ability to command, but in the capacity to care. Every time he looked into her eyes, he was reminded of the night he had almost let her walk away into the rain. The scars of his past hadn't disappeared, but they had been softened by her grace, turned into stories rather than weapons of self-destruction. When the time finally came for an heir to be born, it was not a cold fulfillment of an imperial contract, but a celebration of a love that had defied every law of the land. The child was not merely a biological successor to the Theros line, but a symbol of a new era where blood was less important than the character of the heart. Lucian held his son with hands that no longer trembled with the fear of loss, but with the steady strength of a man who knew exactly what he was protecting. The empire had its future, but it was a future built on the foundation of a shared, beautiful resilience. As the sun set over the spires of Elandor, casting a golden glow across the vast landscape, Lucian and Elara stood on the high balcony together. The world below was peaceful, a testament to the fact that a leader's true strength is found in his vulnerability and his capacity for redemption. He wrapped his heavy cloak around her shoulders, the same one he had offered her in the garden so long ago. But this time, she leaned into his warmth without hesitation. They were no longer the Emperor and the Shadow, but two people who had rewritten their destiny through the simple, revolutionary power of being seen.